Before we get underway, let me take a few seconds to introduce the National Humanities Center. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. What that means is that we run a fellowship program that brings scholars to the Humanities Center in Research Triangle Park, usually for an academic year, to research and write on topics and subjects like history, literature and language, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We offer a wide variety of resources and programs for high school teachers in American history and literature, and you can find everything that we offer by going to americainclass.org, and that will take you to this page, and from this page you can gain access to all of our lessons and our primary sources and the rest of our online seminar schedule for this year. Now, at the end of our seminar this evening, if you return to the Listening to the Past webpage from which you obtained your readings, there you will find a recording of this seminar, the PowerPoint presentation, and an evaluation form. Please feel free to plunder the PowerPoint, use it in your classes, that's what it's there for, and please send us that evaluation form. That's very important to us. We pay attention to what you tell us, and we try to improve our programs based on what we read on those forms. Once we receive your evaluation, you will be able to download a letter that you can submit to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in the seminar warrants. Now, how do you participate? Well, throughout the evening, our leader, Emily Thompson, will be making comments and posing questions, and we hope you'll respond. And the way to do that is to put your cursor in the area that I have bracketed there in green. Type your response, hit that send button to the right, and your message will appear in the large chat box above. I will be following the chat all night and bringing it into the conversation at appropriate moments. Now, those of you who have been with us before know that this is a little bit different. This seminar is a little bit different from the ones we usually do. If we do a seminar in literature, we usually focus on a single text. If we do a seminar in history, we'll focus on a particular topic. Tonight we're talking about a particular approach. A new approach for some of you perhaps, might call it sound studies, bringing sound into the classroom. We all use sound in our classrooms. We use recordings, we'll use videos with a soundtrack. But tonight we're going to be focusing on sound and sound as a way to help us understand how people have experienced the past. We'll be using some recordings, and try to interpret them, but recent scholarly work has used sound to help understand the American Enlightenment, the soundscapes of slave masters and abolitionists, Shakespearean drama. Scholars have recreated the Globe Theater, French concert halls, and the peal of village bells in the 19th century to help us understand the changing structures of religious and political authority. Recently, a scholar from the Humanities Center with a team of technologists developed a soundscape for St. Paul's Cathedral in the 17th century so that you can get a sense of what John Donne's sermons sounded like when he delivered them at that time. An amazing sight. And we're going to be talking about a website, Emily Thompson's website, The Roaring Twenties. That will be a wonderful resource for you to bring sound studies into your classrooms. And that will help address some of the questions from the forum. How can we incorporate sound as a learning experience for students? We're going to be addressing that question directly this evening. How can sound be utilized as a text that can be read in conjunction with larger units? We're going to be addressing that question directly too. How can we improve instruction with new techniques? And how can this topic be integrated into existing lesson plans? I think we'll be able to cover all of those questions quite well this evening. So let us move ahead. We are very pleased to have with us tonight one of the pioneers of sound studies, Emily Thompson, a professor of history at Princeton University. I've already mentioned her website, The Roaring Twenties. Access to that can be on the Listening to the Sound website. The URL is there. You can see the awards Emily has won for her imaginative use of historical materials and archival materials. In 2002, she wrote The Soundscape of Modernity, Architectural Acoustics and the Culture of Listening in America, 1900 to 1933. So let me turn the program over to Emily. Emily, please tell us about sound studies and how we can use sound in the classroom to help people understand how the past was experienced.
Thank you, Richard. I'll certainly try to accomplish that this evening. Thank you all for coming out, or I guess I should say for staying in on what is, in Princeton, New Jersey at least, a snowy evening. Um, I want to start by just sort of sketching out this scholarly field, which is called sound studies. Most often, there are a number of different ways in which it's referred to. Um, you might call it oral history. Sound studies is generally an interdisciplinary endeavor. It incorporates the work not only of historians like myself, but sociologists, anthropologists, musicologists, and students of literature, as well as history. Now, since we're going to focus on the historical aspects of sound studies today, sometimes that subfield is called oral history. You've probably all heard of oral history before, when we invite participants to tell stories about their own histories and past. Oral history puts the emphasis on listening rather than talking. Sometimes we refer to it that way. Another way to refer to it is simply the history of sonic culture. More important than what we call this, I think, is how we do it. And I guess what I want to emphasize to get things started tonight is that I think there are two fundamental elements to keep in mind when you're thinking about the sound of the past. And the first is, of course, quite obviously, the sounds of the past. We can talk about the history of sound. What sounds did people hear in the past? What made sound? But I think what really makes that interesting, rather than simply cataloging the kinds of sounds that were out there, is to think about the meaning of sound, the history of listening. So we're not just thinking about the history of sound, we're also thinking about the history of listening, not just what hits your ear, but what happens in between your ears, in your mind as you listen. And both of these aspects change dramatically over time. Obviously, the kinds of sounds we hear today in many cases are very different from what someone might have heard, say, in ancient Rome. And I would also like to argue that the way we listen, the meaning we attach to sound, is just as different when we compare it in different places and different times. So I think the richest historical approach is to keep both of these phenomena in mind. And for me, the title of the book, which Richard mentioned, The Soundscape of Modernity, this notion of a soundscape, I like it because it brings together these two aspects of the sound of the past. So a soundscape, I talk a little bit more about this in the introduction to my book, which is available on the reading packet that is available with this program this evening. My book is a historical examination of a very particular soundscape that in the United States, primarily the urban culture in the United States in the early 20th century. And this really is my field of expertise that I'll kind of be tapping into as our conversation develops this evening. Now, this time and place may or may not be of specific interest to you, but I think what we do this evening, and certainly the introduction to my book, was also intended to set up more generally just how to think about sound, how to think about any soundscape in any time or place. So I hope that these are generic ways of thinking that you can bring, whether you focus on world civilization, ancient history, or modern America, like myself. Okay? So this notion of a soundscape, it is highlighting both of those elements I mentioned previously. It is both a physical environment and a way of perceiving that environment. A soundscape is a world and a culture constructed to make sense of that world. And again, to do good sound history, I think we need to look at each element in turn. Let's start by thinking about the physical environment, the actual sounds of the past. I've come up with a few different categories to kind of break down the different kinds of sounds that come into play. I won't necessarily claim this covers everything. You may think of others that you would want to add to the list. But certainly we have the sounds of the natural environment, the sounds of earth, of weather, of animals. You might call them non-human sounds, if you want to characterize it that way. We have the sound of voice, the human sound of language and speech. And also, I think it's worth thinking about the kinds of sounds of language, the sound of speech that isn't just carrying content, the way voices rise and fall, how you inflect irony. It's not what you're saying, it's the way you say it. So there are sonic dimensions of speech that don't always end up on the page when they're translated into written language. So you can think about those paralingual aspects of voice as well as the language-based content, the meaning of voice. Okay. We also have the sounds of technology. I am a historian of technology, so this is one of my favorite categories of the material culture of things that make and shape sound. This can include sound making devices, but also devices that silence sound, sound absorbing devices, say. And you could also consider the spaces in which we make and listen to sound, the architecture of sound, which was the subject of my previous book. Okay? And another category I want to throw into the mix here, if you spent some time on my website, you've certainly encountered it already, and that is noise. Now, noise is a much more subjective category than these others were. It can be natural or it can be man-made. One man's noise is another man's music. So a particular sound could be noise to some, but not to others. Perhaps a general way to think about it is as unwanted sound or sound out of place. Noise, I think, is particularly interesting for historians because it is so subjective. It can really help us learn a lot about a society when we think about what they identify as noise, what kinds of sounds are problematic for them. And so, again, my website, The Roaring Twenties, which is about noise in New York City in the 1920s, is an example that can sort of illustrate what you can do by thinking about noise's historical context. So these are the physical categories for thinking about the sound of the past. Let's turn now to the cultural aspects, the meaning of sound, the other side of the soundscape coin, so to speak here. Well, here we can think about the social significance of sound. How is sound deployed within a particular society to organize space or to organize people? Okay? How does sound help a society function? Who gets to speak? When and where are they allowed to do so? Think about the kinds of rules or laws that regulate sonic behavior in a society. All of this I would incorporate under the social significance of sound in a particular historical context. Another category of cultural meaning can be tied with the notion of memory. And we'll talk a bit about this more in relation to one of the readings that was made available for you, Native American history, especially when we think about non-literate people, people who don't have writing and reading. How do they maintain their cultural traditions? How do individuals, as well as larger communities, remember their own history through sound? Okay. We can also think about how sound plays a role in creating community and establishing identity. We all identify ourselves in some ways by the kinds of music we like to listen to. Maybe we advertise that by wearing particular t-shirts, say. We each have kind of sonic brands or sonic stamps. That commercial music is a kind of a valuable tool for building that identity, but there are lots of other ways that sound can be used to shape and form individuals as well as communities' identities. And then I guess a final category that I would throw into the mix here is, of course, the aesthetic significance of sound. And a lot of musical culture would be under this category. I think that You probably have access to music faculty in your schools, and certainly music history is kind of its own subject. My emphasis tonight isn't so much on thinking about music, but all the other kinds of sounds that maybe haven't gotten as much attention over time as music has. Okay, so here are some of the different elements that play constructing a soundscape of the past, physical and cultural. How do you get started then on this endeavor? Well, there are lots of different sources that can be deployed for doing this kind of history. Okay? Perhaps what would come to mind most obviously for most people would be actual recordings of sounds of the past. Now, the phonograph was invented in New Jersey here by Thomas Edison in 1877. So technically from that date on, perhaps a little bit later as they got the technology in shape, we have media, we have sound recordings from the past that we can draw upon as source material for doing our history. But of course, a lot of history happened before 1877, not only in the US, but around the world. So we certainly wouldn't want to limit sound history only to considering a post-phonographic era. So we can also think about how to elicit the sound of the past from silent sources. What do you want to do when a recording isn't available? How do you work with text, with images, with material culture? As historians, we do that all the time. Can we turn to the kinds of sources we're used to working with, but with this particular aim in mind of pulling out from them, from these silent sources, the sound of the past? Okay. So I think actually it makes sense to start with this latter kind of source, the silent sources, and then move on to working with sound recordings a bit later in our conversation. So what we'll start with in terms of opening this up and to bring your thoughts and ideas into the conversation is to turn to an essay assignment, which I have given to students in the past, and which was posted on the forum. For some of you might have taken a look at it already. Now, I should mention that I'm a college teacher, but this assignment is something that I've given to freshmen, so at least to very young college students, and it's something that they've really enjoyed doing, and in fact have done quite well. So I think it might be useful for you and your students as well. So let's take a look at part of this assignment sheet that was made available for you. And Richard, do you want me to read this out loud, or how would you like
sure.
to?
Why don't we do that? Put that on the table for us so that we're all focused on it. It's a good idea.
Okay. Okay. All right. This was an assignment for a written essay. And excuse me one second. I'm going to take a sip of water here. Sorry, I was shoveling snow all afternoon. I'm a little dried out. All right, using one of many resources for exploring historical newspapers, find and read an article about an event from the past. Now here, being at Princeton University with a library full of rich holdings, we have access to databases of historical newspapers. So part of this assignment was to give the students the freedom to find an article. You could certainly provide that to your classes if you don't have those kinds of resources available, but that's really just the starting point. What they do with these articles, I think, is what's of most interest to us here tonight. Try to discover the sonic dimensions of this event from the textual account, as well as from any images or photographs that are included with the article. Describe how your source indicates, or perhaps fails to indicate, the general sounds of the era and place, as well as those of the specific event that they document. Then examine what those sounds can or could add to our historical understanding of this slice of the past. You may hone in on just one article or consider several from the same paper or different ones. You may simply select a general period and place that interests you and see what you find, or you might choose to identify a specific event. For example, a Civil War battle. The 1883 explosion of the Indonesian volcano Krakatoa, which was heard over 2,000 miles away at the time, literally around the Earth. The 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington, the 1969 Woodstock Music Festival, or anything else. And I encourage the students to choose a time, at least 10 years in the past, just to make sure it wasn't something they actually had memories of. I wanted that distance to challenge them. And so it's really a kind of a detective assignment to read a source and see if you can pull sound out of it. I prompt ways of thinking about how to do this with a series of questions. Think about whether or not sound is being explicitly incorporated into the account that you read. Can you understand from your source what this time and place sounded like? If so, how is the sound described? Does it serve as a significant element of the story, or is it deployed to add atmosphere? If the sound is not explicitly described or depicted, can you still intuit it from the material? If so, what kind of textual or visual clues can help you imagine these sounds? If the sound is not there, explicitly or implicitly, think about what it might have added to the account. What's missing when we don't have the sound of the past, in other words? Finally, does the sonic element tell you more about this past world than simply what it sounded like? Does it help you to understand the people, the problems, the priorities of the society under consideration? And I think that final prompt there is important. Ideally, sound history should not simply be adding a soundtrack to the past. It shouldn't simply be adding sound to what we already know. It should help us learn new things. It should prompt us to interpret new evidence in new ways. So if you can really get your students to think about sound in ways that challenge or interrogate what they already know, then I think that's the ultimate goal. That may not happen easily or right away, but ultimately we want that to be the payoff. So I think this kind of an assignment is a great way to start students thinking about sound. They're doing close reading, which they're probably doing in other contexts in your history courses, really digging into a text, which is a skill they're probably already familiar with doing, but digging in with perhaps a new intention, which is to pull these sounds out. It exemplifies the kind of detective work that underlies all history, really, looking for clues, trying to find things that have been lost, the past more generally, the sound of the past, perhaps more specifically. So Richard kind of rose to the challenge here and did this assignment with the two sample articles that I included in the readings, New York Times account of the March for Civil Rights on Washington and also Woodstock. He had some comments based on his own reading, but of course, perhaps we could bring in some of your own comments about this as well. I'll turn it over to Richard to sort of see what we would like to do with these articles now.
Well, before we plunge ahead into the articles, let me ask a question here, Emily. The two pieces you gave us on, we have the a March on Washington in 1963 and Woodstock in 1969. Now, these are events that we have the soundtrack for. I mean, everybody has seen and heard the Martin Luther King speech, the highlight of the March on Washington, and I suspect that lots and lots of people have seen the film Woodstock. So how do you handle situations like that when you have recordings and, in the case of the Martin Luther King speech, an iconic recording of the event? How do you handle that vis-a-vis the written silent text?
Okay. Well, I guess when certainly for this assignment, I would not make those recordings available. I'd want to focus on the exercise of reading and looking and trying to pull sound out of that visual experience. But in a case where that media is out there, as you said, it's likely that your students have encountered actual recordings of these sounds. I would say you could simply invite them to contrast this account and say, does the written account sound like what you have heard? or
Hmm.
does it make you think of the event in a different way? If you hadn't heard that recording, what would you imagine it sounded like? Does that map onto what you've heard, or
Hmm.
is it really different in a sense? So you could challenge them that way, I think. And there are examples when students, though, who are familiar with a recording have done this assignment, read some articles, and come up with much richer understandings. One student in my class, I didn't include the article here, but he read about the famous 1984 hockey game between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Olympics, which the U.S. quite surprisingly won. And he read a couple of articles about the evening leading up to this game, the game, and of course he had heard the kind of broadcast or the telecast of this game. He's a big hockey fan, but what he discovered in these accounts was this sonic contrast between America and the Soviet Union, and how the kind of Cold War ideological battle was being played out in the ways
Hmm.
these two different teams were described, what it was like on the buses as each was going to the arena, and how the audience behaved, and all of that. So in fact, I think reading these accounts and challenging himself to think more deeply about the whole sonic experience, he came away with a much richer understanding of a recording that he had heard before, and would, I'm sure, continue to listen to and enjoy. So that's just an example of how they can play off of each other. A lot of students will choose Civil War accounts, or one chose a steamboat explosion in the 19th century when, of course, no recordings even existed. So there it
Hmm.
really is just a challenge to their sonic imagination to conjure up the sounds that we only can know through the words.
So that your term sonic imagination, I think, is really fascinating. So basically, when we we do this assignment with material that for which for which there's no recording. You're really asking students to exercise their sonic imagination. So this is a way to stimulate the imagination of students to step back into the past. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, we have apparently there's a good deal of interest in Woodstock, so why don't we start with
Okay.
that one? I apologize, we don't have excerpts from the article to put up on the screen, but I hope some of you have read the Woodstock piece. If you haven't, please check it out back on the website. But we have two folks here who obviously have memories, maybe from the event itself. There were 300,000 people there, but now I think 3 million people claim to have been there. Um, Amelia Philbrook writes, I had the same problem. When I try to think about Woodstock, all I can think of is Jimi Hendrix and the Star Spangled Banner. Yes, I can. Emily, let me ask you a question. Is it fair to say iconic sounds, since icons are visual images? Is that a fair term?
Oh, absolutely. I think so.
Okay.
And here too, I think the student who chose this article was coming from the same place as you, unless you were actually
Right.
there. He, of course, was
I was
not.
there. I really was.
Yeah, were you? Okay, yeah. But
No,
well,
I'm
this
kidding.
this kid
I wasn't there.
wasn't even born yet, of course. But he had
Uh,
seen the movies or the newsreels or what have you. But what he discovered in the sound of Woodstock that he pulled out of this article was
uh-huh.
that his historic hypothesis was that for the vast majority of people there, they didn't hear Hendrix the way the people who watch the movie have heard Hendrix, and what we think of as, him sort of embodying Woodstock, that most of those people were so far from the stage, even with those giant towers of loudspeakers and with so much
Right.
else going on, the sounds of Woodstock, what was happening on stage was just one piece of that and not the primary piece for, thousands and thousands of people's experience of this event.
Right. And JG writes, what about Country Joe and the Fish? So that was the iconic sound that he remembers. And another one of our participants writes, good thing we're not talking about smells at Woodstock. Emily, that maybe that's the next
That's a
academic
seminar for another
frontier.
scholar to take
That's
on,
the
I
next
guess.
one.
Yes, I don't do
Okay, well,
smell.
we we have a number of folks out there who are describing Woodstock. Many people have seen the film. Why don't we ask our participants to tell us what their iconic sounds are? If you remember the film, or if you were one of the 3 million people who were there, Jefferson Airplane. Okay, what are some of the other things we remember? Now, the film, of course, focused largely, obviously, on the music, but there were scenes of the crowd. There were, contextual shots. What do we remember? Hendrix again. That. Let's see. Anyone else want to suggest their sonic the rainstorm? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Anything else that we have that we can compare this article to your sonic memories? I'm sure most of the sound was static, bass, and chattering voices. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anything else before we plunge into this article? Okay, Emily, why don't we turn to it? Being a good student here, I read it several times, and right off the bat, in the first sentence, we hear about the drenching rainstorms. So one of our participants there got that right. The next paragraph, we talk about wailing music, but then we hear the writer say most of the hip swinging youngsters, this was written, remember, in 1969, when we were all hip swinging youngsters, heard the music on the stage only as a distant rumble. For them, it was almost impossible for them to tell who was performing, and probably only about half of the crowd could hear a note. So there's another sonic sign. And then one of the organizers comments about how quiet the crowd was. 300,000 people, and he was quiet. Now, I would say, in my cynical old age here, that he was trying to put a spin on that, but perhaps you could address that. We have reports of announcements. You are not taking poison acid. The acid's not poison. It's just badly manufactured acid. You are not going to die. We have treated 300 cases, and it's just badly manufactured acid. So that was an announcement that went out, and if you remember in the movie, that announcement is caught in the movie. More comments about the music, how the music migrated from folk songs like "We Shall Overcome" to hard rock. The article ends by talking about the helicopters. The performers were at first ferried to the site by helicopter from an airport in nearby Liberty, a town in upstate New York. But the promoters were forced to abandon this plan when most of the copters developed mechanical difficulties and the gasoline pumps ran out of gas. I think if I could just add my comments, some people remembered Jimi Hendrix, other people remembered Country Joe and the Fish. I remember the helicopters because that chopper sound was iconic in the 1960s. I mean, here you are juxtaposing helicopters in Woodstock, a festival of peace, love, and music, with the iconic sound of Vietnam. Helicopters landing in rice paddies. We have some other comments here. Actually, we don't. Okay, so that would be my reading. I would work that up, Emily, in a paper, and at Princeton, would I get an A?
Well, it would depend on how well you wrote it, but I think certainly the ideas are in place. I just maybe go back to one thing you mentioned. It was earlier in the article in the second column, if any of you have it on hand. You referred to Michael Lang, one of the producers of the event, who said, it's about the quietest, most well-behaved 300,000 people in one place that can be imagined. There have been no fights or incidents of violence of any kind. That's, and as you're right, he was probably interested in presenting a particular image of this event, wanting to, play up the peacefulness, the civility of this gathering. And so that's an example, I think, of what we might say is a biased source here. We've dealt with them, I'm sure, in other historic contexts, but how sound can be deployed for people to put spin on events. He wants to present it a certain way, so he is actually going to call this gathering of 300,000 people quiet. So I think that when you can find how sound history gets written into people's larger agendas, I think that's takes you beyond just simply cataloging. Identifying the sounds, pulling the sounds out is a good way to start, but then to see what you can do with those descriptions. What's the message underlying the sound portrait that's being painted is even better. And the other article that I included that described the March on Washington was an example of a student who was able to do that as well. And that account, when she read it, she identified all the different sounds of this other, mass gathering taking place in a very different context and for very different reasons. But she was struck by how at least the author of this newspaper article characterized all these sounds sort of through the framework of religion, referring to it as a kind of a Sunday school picnic, or pointing out, choirs and hymns being sung, and then of course, Reverend King preaching in essence through his speech. And I remember she wrote about how this was a way of representing this event. Certainly, she was curious. She raised questions that the article wasn't sufficient to answer, but they're good questions of whether this tone was a reflection of the importance of the churches and religious culture in underlining the civil rights movement, or if it was a way of representation, that the journalist wanted to present it not as political protest, as a revolutionary social event, but to try to kind of make it safer for the readers of the New York Times by putting it in that context. So the way the sounds were described raised good questions for her, and she got an A. I can say that.
Let's ask our participants now. Many of our participants may not have seen the Woodstock movie, but I know everybody out there is familiar with the iconic Martin Luther King speech from the March on Washington. So let me pose a question to our participants sonically. Now, sonically speaking, how do you all remember? Many of you probably weren't around in 1963, but you've seen films. How do you remember what are your sonic memories of that event? If you could share those with us in the chat. How do you remember that event? I know the cameras, the film strips the films you saw probably focused on Reverend King in his famous speech, but my memory of those films, you can hear the background. There are people behind him nodding and speaking, and you can hear the crowd in front of him. So give us your sonic memories of the March on Washington in 1963. I can tell you that for Woodstock in 1969, I was in Chapel Hill, and in 1963, I was actually at football camp in August of 1963. So we didn't get a whole lot of news about the March on Washington. That's interesting, too, because now that speech is iconic, and the New York Times article reports it, history in the raw. It's just straight up, and it's kind of surprising. We'll get to what the author says about the speech, but it's kind of surprising to see it put in a taken out of its iconic status and reported just as a kind of, this also happened at this event. Okay, Madeline writes, I think more about the audio recording of the actual speech. There is very little to hear but his booming voice. I think about the way he speaks and how the general tone, diction, and pacing he uses is so different than the way we speak today. Would you like to comment on that? I mean, that obviously Martin Luther King was in the black evangelical tradition. You wouldn't speak that way on the street today, but could you comment on that? That's a really interesting comment from Madeline.
Well, I think that it raises the question of whether he was sort of bringing the sonic rhetoric of of preaching within, his church's culture to this event. It might have been familiar to many of the people who were gathered there and who heard him that day because they were coming out of that place. I think to connect it with the writing, the description in the article, though, I think it's very interesting, even though, of course, the speech has just happened. It's not iconic in the way it can only be through the passage of time and the sort of accumulation of long-term significance and meaning. But you can tell it's important, even, in this running account of everything else that's going on that day. And I think the sound of his voice is something that the writer is trying to capture in the section where he is describing the speech. Paragraph after paragraph starts with a quote, "I have a dream, ... and the journalist reiterates that. It's not a full transcription of his speech, but he's trying very much to capture the cadences, the repetitive patterns that are what make that speech, so sort of musical and powerful as well as socially significant. So to sort of see the effort to capture that in text, I think is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then we have a comment from Allison. The audience's voice is rising up, engaging and entangling with Dr. King's voice in an almost spiritual way. Well, that reflects what your student at Princeton found in the piece. Another participant writes, the songs uniting the people and expressing their thought, emotions, and support for the cause. And then Judith Batten writes both his voice and the message he builds. So why don't we turn to the article, folks? If you have it out there in front of you, you could follow along. Right off the bat, in the second paragraph, the author is talking about the songs and the speeches, which you would expect. He is also talking about how groups were clapping. In fact, there was an air of hootenanny. Now, that is a 1960s word. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that word, it means kind of folk festival, folk gathering, folk songs. Hootenanny, about it as a group of school children clapped hands and swung to the familiar freedom songs. John Kennedy, in his written comment, talks about the deep fervor and the quiet dignity, but the event really wasn't very quiet. It was peaceful, but not quiet. Later on in the article, the writer describes it as a song fest. When Martin Luther King stood up to speak, a great roar welled up from the crowd. When he started to speak, a hush fell. So we have a roar and a hush. What's interesting to me about the piece, though, is the paragraph before the author introduces King's speech. He writes two paragraphs. Let me give you the two paragraphs. This is the two paragraphs before he introduces Martin Luther King. The other leaders, except for the 3 clergymen among the 10, concentrated on the struggle ahead and spoke in tough, even harsh language. Next paragraph. But paradoxically, it was Dr. King who had suffered perhaps most of all, who ignited the crowd with words that might have been written by the sad, brooding man enshrined within, speaking, of course, of Abraham Lincoln. That struck me as really odd, Emily, that in 1963, Martin Luther King's speech, it's a paradox. That was the speech that engaged people. Today, looking back on that, we all strike our heads and say, well, of course, that was the highlight. But in 1963, before the speech became iconic, that was a kind of paradox.
Mm-hmm. Or I think he's also pointing out that if anyone was sort of justified in speaking, rough truth to power, it would be King. But he chose not to speak in the harsh language of those other men who had preceded him, but to take on this eloquent, musical tone to create this speech that we all know today. Yeah.
Right. Well, as Madeline writes, as Allison said, the mingling of voices is emphasized when the article mentions the human tide of people, because a strong visual, but also a strong sound of one rolling voice of force. I think that's a beautiful phrase, a voice of force. What do you think about that, Emily?
that is a great way to put it. Yes, I think.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it does give the sense that, this audience, I mean, they were here to testify and to petition for civil rights, but they were also there to hear Dr. King. So,
Hmm.
the roar when he took the podium and the hush when he began. And it doesn't sound like it was a call and response where they were interacting with him while the speech was going on. So you imagine that tide kind of building and then
Yeah.
receding, and the quiet of hundreds of thousands of people is so much louder, than the quiet of 6 or 7 or 12. So I think that also can give you a sense of the momentousness of this occasion for the people who were there. Yeah.
Hmm. Right. I have seen a program from the 1963 March on Washington, and it lists all these speakers. There are a lot of speakers, and when it gets to Martin Luther King, it simply says "Remarks by Martin Luther King." That's it. No indication in that program that that is the climactic, culminating speech of the event. Just remarks, and some remarks they were. The article goes on and catches what your student talked about in the late paragraph. Excuse me. As a result, the whole affair at the monument grounds began to take on the spontaneity of a church picnic. Um, Even before the entertainment was to begin, groups of high school students were singing with wonderful improvisation and hand clapping all over the monument slope. So there we have another reference to sound. And then the article goes on. The pros took over, starting with folk singers. The crowd joined with them. Joan Baez started the singing rolling with the song, and his the song in quotes, the song "We Shall Overcome." Joan was also singing "We Shall Overcome" at Woodstock. She seemed to pop up a lot in the '60s. Then it goes on. This is what I think this was really fascinating. Late in the article, the march was to be from the Lincoln. The march to the Lincoln Memorial was supposed to start at 11:30 behind the leaders, but at 11:30 it set off spontaneously down Constitution Avenue behind the Kenilworth Knights, a local drum and bugle corps dazzling in yellow silk blazers, green trousers, and green berets. Apparently forgotten was the intention to make the march to the Lincoln Memorial a solemn tribute to Medgar W. Evers, NAACP official murdered in Jackson, Mississippi last June 12th, and others who had died for the cause of civil rights. So there, the the description of the sound contradicts the intentions of the organizers. Did your student catch that? How would you respond to that, Emily?
I don't remember that she specifically highlighted that
Mm-hmm.
passage, but it does give you a sense of, how these events do sort of take on a life of their own,
Mm-hmm.
and are, that um, you can plan them, but you can't control what actually happens. One of our participants is referring to the conversations that were taking place behind the speakers. So,
Mm-hmm.
that there's a lot going on in such a rich event here. That certainly gives a sense of that sort of
Mm-hmm.
complexity and pushing and pulling in different directions, and how, if you go back to the Woodstock analogy, a documentary filmmaker points the camera and creates this concentrated event that doesn't really capture the simultaneity and kind of chaos of everything that's going on at the
Mm-hmm.
time, pulling in different directions when you're actually there.
Mhm. Well, if I had been in your class and writing a paper on these two articles, well, on the last one, the March on Washington, I don't know if I would have connected it so much with the religious tradition. I think I would have um, seized more on the hand clapping and the song fest aspect of it, and it was more of a celebratory event. I mean, I think
Okay.
this was.
Mhm.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
I think for this student, she came out of that kind of church
Uh-huh.
herself. So
Oh,
religion
sure.
was celebratory for her.
Yeah.
Religion didn't mean sober and sort of religious. It,
Right.
it meant that kind of joyous, jubilant expression of hope and faith. So
Right.
yeah.
Well, let's ask our participants this type of assignment. Would you use it with your students? How well do you think it would work? Let's hear. Would the learning goal of this writing assignment be to better understand the culture of the period? Emily, how would you respond to that?
I think ultimately, that's the big goal. You may not get there right away, though. I think you want to sort of teach them to pull these sonic cues out, simply to find them, figure out what they can and can't tell us. But ideally, you would add that to the pot with all the other historical clues that have helped us understand these events, and hopefully this sonic dimension would enhance or perhaps challenge that understanding.
hmm hmm So we have some other folks writing in. Now let's wait before we move on to see how they would respond to this as an assignment. I myself think this is an excellent assignment, and were I teaching again, I would certainly steal it and use it. It's a great way to focus students' attention and to get them to do close reading. I mean, I think any excuse to get students to read, slow down, and read documents closely is something that ought to be used in the classroom. Judith Batten writes, would it be worthwhile to compare descriptions of a particular event? Oh, that's good. How do
That
you
would
think
be
about what do you think
interesting.
about that?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
if you could come up with sources, from people with very different perspectives, whether, if it's a political event,
Mm-hmm.
pros and cons, or just different cultures, that would be a wonderful example where, the same thing is happening, but it is being recorded in two different ways. Are people actually hearing it differently
Mm-hmm.
because they bring such different perspectives or expectations to this kind of event? I think you could also, in a classroom setting, especially if you are providing these texts, the students don't have this dimension of going out and finding their own like-minded. I think it would work in small groups too. You could have a couple of students working together on a single article and helping each other pull these sounds out, and then thinking about what they mean. Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Amelia Philbrook writes, I like this idea to add another dimension to some of those old pieces that students repeatedly see. That's a great idea. That would be a way to rejuvenate some of the kind of tired old texts that come in front of the eyes of students all the time.
Sure.
And then let's see, JG, great assignment. I might modify this assignment for the Battle of San Jacinto in Texas history. There you go. Let's see, Madeline, thanks. That makes sense to challenge, support. To challenge or support the other accounts of the time. That would be great. Yeah, that's a kind of, this is a kind of hidden, not a hidden, but it's an unexpected piece of evidence that you can adduce to make an historical case. Would that be fair to say, Emily?
Yeah, and I think some of the scholars who work on sound, I worry sometimes that they want to live in this sound ghetto where that's all they think about. Whereas, as I've
Uh-huh.
said before, this should just be one of all the different tools in our toolkit. So to add this to the mix, and throw it in with what we've learned through different means, or by looking at pictures. Another, if you could find well, and for this assignment, some students actually, and some of them who were more interested in visual art, would look at a painting, typically a painting of an event, not just a portrait or something like that, and try to imagine what the society sounded like based on simply reading an image. So that's another
Mm-hmm.
way to throw, sonic thinking in with other kinds of historical ways of knowing the past. And you might imagine, this would take a little bit of effort, but if you found a photograph of an event, you could start with that and just say, what do you
Mm-hmm.
think this sounded like? Just by looking at the picture, looking for visual clues in that sense. And then you could read a newspaper account, say, well, does this journalist's account in words reinforce what you pulled out of this photograph? And then if you had media, if it was something like Woodstock where recordings existed, you could interrogate all these different kinds of historical evidence and see where they match up and where they push and pull against each other.
Right. Amelia writes again, for an English class, it would be a great way to demonstrate emotion in writing. Madeline writes, you could provide and compare text and then compare what students get out of the text because each student will attend to something different. Yeah, I think this is a wonderful way to give students, I'm using a visual image again here, a lens through which to look. You mentioned photographs, and I'm just now looking at the Woodstock article, and in the front, the photograph right at the top of the article, you have this vast sea of humanity and the big stage, and you can understand why the music was just a distant rumble. And then in another photograph, you have the stage set up in the background. It's closer; you can see it, and it's pretty massive. And if you were to look at the movie again, you could see that the stage was indeed quite large, and the speakers were large. And then there's a couple hiding under an umbrella so you can hear the patter of the rain. And there's another guy asleep, or well, sitting, lying down in his tent with his motorcycle next to him. So you creative writing prompt on using sound to convey the scene. An excellent suggestion. I think we've given our teachers an awful lot to take back to their classes.
Great. Well, maybe we should move on
Yeah, let's move on to the.
to
To, we have some other suggested assignments on the next
right.
slide.
The
We
ne
could talk
before I
briefly about
Yeah,
those.
before I advance to that slide though, and the next one is a bit hypothetical. It's not something I've actually done in class, but um, with the reading that I offered you from Richard Rath's book, which is about New England Native American tribes in the 17th century and colonists, and it's really, the book is called How Early America Sounded, and he's considering all these different sonic cultures, the indigenous sonic culture of the Native Americans, the European colonists who come, the Africans who are brought involuntarily and bring their sonic culture across with them. Since he studies New England, there isn't a whole lot of slavery happening in the period that he studies yet. But the piece I pulled out is focusing on Native American sonic culture. And I thought it was a great example of how you can do a really rich sonic history in an era in which there are no recordings. But I think there are larger lessons to learn from what he tells us about Native American sonic culture. Most Native American tribes in this area at this time were illiterate cultures. They didn't need reading and writing to thrive. They had, sophisticated social and political ways of living. They did not have writing, though, and so he's describing the ways that a society can function without writing. Just kind of foreign to us, I think, in a world that's just so saturated with text that we live in. But interestingly, there are some parallels in his description of how Native Americans just kind of did their culture without writing. There are some interesting comparisons to modern digital culture, and in particular with the idea of sort of memory. And in his account of how treaties and diplomacy is carried out, initially within Native American tribes and then later between Native Americans and European colonists. His sources, of course, are the Europeans, who are often getting things wrong when they try to describe what they're seeing and hearing because these cultures are so foreign. But what he shows is ways that Native tribes focused on building a kind of communal memory. In a way that was much hardier and more rigorous than counting on individuals to remember what words were spoken, what treaties and agreements were enacted between different peoples. And what they came up with basically was a system of communal memory in which memory was both distributed and redundant. Just as we're always told, to back up our hard drive in multiple iterations and to put those disks in different places to ensure that our digital memory is not vulnerable to being wiped out. This is basically what Native Americans were doing with their cultural memory, and so he describes how they enacted that. And so I came up with this idea. I'll advance the slide now, and you can tell me whether you think this would work in say, a high school or junior high classroom setting, to compare different ways of remembering things. And the first, which is more like what we typically do in modern society today, is demonstrated by this game telephone, which you've probably done before, maybe you've even had classes do before. You recite some information, a passage, a bit of text, a poem, or what have you. You whisper it into one student's ear. Just give it to them once, and then they whisper it to the next student in the line, and it goes from one to another, and bits of error are introduced at each step along the way, and these errors propagate. So by the time you get to the end of the line, the message that that last student heard often has very little to do with the message that you originated. And that shows the sort of weakness of that kind of system of memory. Important information, if that was, a treaty or an agreement between tribes, and it would have gotten lost through that kind of individualized memory practice. So the Native Americans did it differently. They called upon different members of the community, each to be in charge of remembering just one piece. And they had symbols and rituals, these memory sticks and prompters, sort of enacted. You remember this, you remember that, you remember that. And so each person is just in charge of one little piece of information. Nobody remembers the whole thing, but the community remembers the whole thing in a much more rigorous and a sort of a much more much less vulnerable way. And so it seemed to me that you could also enact a kind of activity of communal memory, sort of following Wrath, if you go back and read that, and just see how much better the class as a whole is in remembering something significant and important and sustained than that telephone exercise would show. And then the backup system is that for each person who's in charge of remembering one piece of the content, they have a friend in Native American culture. It was often the man's family, his wife and children were the backup discs, so that if something happens to him, someone else can step in and that piece will not be lost. So the memory is distributed and it's redundant, and it's a very rigorous way of preserving community, not just the treaties that enable it to interact with other communities, but the communal memory, the stories, the practices, the history of their own past. So I think, possibly to do those two exercises in class would indicate just the different nature of these ways of remembering. One focuses on the individual. The other, the individual only exists as a piece of the community. This exercise kind of brings that out. But then what you can do with that, if you're actually teaching Native American history, I think, is that this opens a new window to how devastating the implications of colonization were for this culture. Imagine if smallpox hits, well, you lose that piece of the story, and you lose your backup discs because the whole family gets wiped out. So a piece is gone forever, let alone if a whole village gets wiped out. Or through warfare, Native Americans, when they fought, they didn't typically wipe out their enemies. They took them captive, they adopted them, they brought them into the tribes. But with the kind of total warfare that European culture brought with it, when huge, sort of populations of tribes will die, that memory again is gone forever. There are holes in the treaties leading to political chaos between tribes, as well as the problems between Native Americans and Europeans. So you would kind of get a new window, to again use another visual metaphor, of how this society was breaking up from within due to the challenges brought from European colonization. So I think that sonic culture here, and Richard Rath does this really well in his book, I think, it offers a new way of perceiving the challenges to Native Americans that were presented by European colonization and understanding how difficult it was to sustain their culture, their sonic culture, um, under the onslaught of these new kinds of practices, as well as just the explicit, sort of hostility of European warfare.
Right. Emily, let me ask our participants what they think of this exercise and how they might use it in class. It strikes me, in addition to using it to teach about Native American culture, you could use this in an English class to talk about communications. You could use it in a social studies class to talk about the strength and the value of community. I could see this being played in a number of different ways. You could put the message out there, have one group who is not passing the message, but who are the sort of keepers of the message and who could judge how reliable the people relate it, and compare the way the individual relays it in the first example, the play telephone, and then compare how well the communal example conveys the message when you have each, one sentence or so entrusted to an individual. That would, I think, make a wonderful class assignment and illustrate those principles quite well. I know when I taught high school, kids love this sort of thing. And let's hear from our teachers. What do you think? Do you think this would be something worthwhile in your classes? Would you use it? How do you think your students would respond to it? Some folks clicking in. Okay. I love to do a class test where each person has to remember one answer to demonstrate how important this type of communication would have been. Okay, let's get some comments from some other participants here before we move on to do some sound analysis of our own tonight. A number of folks typing in. Just wait a second to see what comes across the chat. I did show you my age. I keep talking about what's coming over the wire, and of course there are no wires. Yeah, and transom. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, nobody knows what a transom is anymore.
Yeah, that's dates us all here, doesn't it? But
our window is at the bottom of the screen. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. The second activity would be great because it's challenging and truly makes everyone rely on each other. Very good point. It works for African griot history. Very good point. My middle school always purposely changed the telephone game.
Oh, okay. It's more fun when the message gets really distorted. That is true.
Yeah,
you can't blame them for that.
Yeah, it is. And since they know it's a game, maybe some students would deliberately distort it. I know that's what I would have done in high school. You tell them that too. Okay. Jay is typing. Let's get his comment, and then we'll move on to do some of our own sound. And now we've got a few other folks typing in here.
Maybe.
Okay, well, Emily, why?
Oh, I was just going to say that for the telephone game, you'd have to offer some sort of incentive for them to try to get it right.
Yeah. An A. Okay, Emily, while people are typing in, why don't you move us ahead and set the context for what we're going to see in the next two slides.
Okay. Well, now what we're going to do is move on to thinking about sonic history through sonic sources when we have actual recordings to draw upon, how to work with historic sound recordings. And here, I'm just going to give you a few little snippets of material that come from my website, The Roaring Twenties. If you haven't had an opportunity to spend some time with that prior to our session this evening, I'll just briefly sketch this out for you. It's an interactive multimedia website, which is sort of focused on considering the sound culture of New York City in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and in particular thinking about urban noise. It's a period in time when American cities were concerned about noise as a problem, and that is well documented in sound newsreel footage that offers the actual sound recordings that we'll be getting a taste of. The website also includes a lot of text and some other visual imagery. I go to the municipal archives of the city of New York and looked at all the letters of complaint about noise that people wrote in to the mayor or the commissioner of health. And in many cases, you can see those letters. They've all been placed on a map. You can interact with all of this content either spatially by seeing it all mapped out across the city's 5 boroughs, or there's another way where you can come at it through the type of noise. If you're interested in railroads, if you're interested in subways, and see what kind of material is on the website based on the kind of noise or sound there is. And then we also have a timeline that just kind of lays everything out. The point is just to go into this world, swim around amidst all this material, and think about what it was like to live in New York City at this time, so that when you do play the recordings and you hear the historic sounds, hopefully we've addressed how you hear between your ears as well as through your ears, and to take you back to that mindset, to put you in a rich context of information, so that you don't just listen to 1929, but you listen as if it were 1929. So that's the goal of the website. Simply clicking play is not sufficient. You want to enable people to listen with a historical mindset, to give them some context, which we build up through all the tools that historical analysis can offer, and bring that to our listening activity. It's a little hard, it's meant to be immersive. It's meant to be a very rich experience. Just pulling out a couple movie clips and one letter, which is all I'm really going to do this evening, is really just, dipping our toe into the sonic ocean. But I hope that you'll return to it on your own. And I'm very interested in thinking about how this could be used as a classroom tool. In the coming year, I hope to get some funding to work with some people to develop a kit of lesson plans and exercises and things to put this website to use. I don't have that in place right now, but if you have any ideas that you would be willing to share with us all just off the top of your head this evening, or to follow up through the forum, or you can certainly email me at my Princeton email address if this is something that you do down the road, that would be great. Okay.
Okay, if I may just interject here, for our English teachers out there, if I were teaching The Great Gatsby, I would go to the Roaring Twenties website and search it out for sounds that could provide a sonic background for that novel. This would work beautifully for that. Okay, Emily, shall we move ahead and let the folks hear what New York sounded like in what year was this?
Okay, I'm going to show you just a brief clip of sound newsreel footage from 1929, the fall of 1929. And the sound quality is not great running through this program that we're all using this evening. It's much better if you simply go to the website yourself and listen in there. This first clip is of a street that was known as Radio Row. It's Cortlandt Street in downtown Manhattan. It's part of the neighborhood that was actually torn down to build the original World Trade Center in the early 1970s. And it was famous in 1929 for being where there was a huge concentration of electronics radio stores. And in the late 1920s, these stores began to sort of advertise themselves out on the street by installing loudspeakers kind of over the transom, so to speak, over the front door, and simply broadcasting out into the street. So in this clip, you'll hear the sounds of the street, you'll hear traffic, there are cars, there are still horses and carts, there's an elevated train line nearby, but you'll also see and hear all these radio shops broadcasting their wares. So I'm just going to advance to this clip and initiate it so that it will hopefully play for you all. You can do a kind of sonic catalog here too, and this is something that you might invite your students to do if you work with this website. At first, at least, simply listen to the clip, catalog, keep track of everything that you're hearing. If you were there on that city street, can you identify the sources of everything you hear? So let's advance and give that a play. All right, I'm going to skip that slide and play this. Here we go. And again, the sound is much better if you go directly to the website yourself. Okay, I'm going to stop it there, and we can just get some reactions or responses from the audience.
Okay, what did we hear? And how we talked about the meaning of sound, recorded music, people talking, shouts, live music, whistling, bells, cars' horn, horses, buggies. Okay?
Well done.
Yeah. I like that there were both horses and cars in the clip, lots of crowd noise. What else
Yeah.
did we hear?
I was surprised in this footage at the juxtaposition of old and new. It was startling to me, to see what looks like a modern city street with buses and cars rolling by, and then suddenly a horse and carriage appear. That was just really bizarre for me. And you can hear the clopping, the distinctive sound, that centuries-old sound of horse traffic.
Right.
Within the mix of all these far more modern sounds.
Okay, sounds like some wind, lively. Sounds like Los Angeles even today, except for the horse honking and people yelling out to come to a cafe or a store. Emily,
I think somebody was saying taxi. I think we had someone hailing a cab at some point.
hailing a cab. Yeah. Emily, let me ask now. Put this in some additional context for us. How new was the radio in 1929?
Okay, well, radio itself was not a new technology. People were using and playing with radios from the early days of the 20th century, but loudspeakers were relatively new. It was only in the early 1920s that people began to listen to radio and for radio broadcasts, entertainment radio, to appear on the scene. This happens in the 1920s. Previously, people listened on little headsets, and a lot of the radio signals were just Morse code even. So entertainment radio, but particularly the loudspeaker. The loudspeaker is what's new. And this opportunity to have a powerful loudspeaker broadcasting amplified sound out into the street was quite new to the late 1920s. This was a distinctive sound, and in fact, it was so bothersome. At least, I mean, here it's all shops, it's all business, but in many other parts of the city, there was a radio shop on a residential street, and if they had a loudspeaker blasting all day, it quickly drove people crazy. This sound actually motivated the aldermen, the city governance, to write a new law outlawing that practice shortly after this footage was captured.
And we have a good question here. Where were the women?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I had always read, from my graduate years on, that downtown Manhattan in the early 20th century, that no respectable woman would be seen on the streets down there. They never went below Herald Square, which is where Macy's and all the department stores were. And this always seemed a bit strange to me, but this film, visually at least, really makes that evident. And imagine just placing yourself as a woman, in this footage on that sidewalk, surrounded by men with no other women around. You can understand why, you wouldn't want to necessarily be there because no other women were there. And it really does heighten the fact that in this business district, in this financial district, this is an era, when female secretaries in corporations are just beginning to enter the scene, secretaries even were male. This really was, a gender segregated city in many ways that we just don't really sort of have today, or I had found it hard to appreciate that aspect of the past, but this film kind of brought it out for me.
And to underscore again, this cacophony was new in American cities in the 20s. Is that fair to say?
It was, yes. I think, noise has always been a problem. You can go back to ancient Pompeii, and there's graffiti where people are complaining about the barking dogs and, the noise that people make at night. But in the early 20th century, and particularly in the 1920s, there are all these new technological sounds, the internal combustion engines, the loudspeakers, the elevated trains, and then, the excavation to bury them and turn them into subways.
Mm-hmm.
People perceived that they lived in this unprecedentedly loud era. And these were new kinds of sounds, which I think is what made them disturbing, perhaps even more than just the volume level. It was perceived to be a new kind of problem. And in many cases, including the city of New York, they organized resources. New York founded a noise abatement commission in 1929 to try
Mm-hmm.
to understand and then alleviate this problem. Of course, anyone who's been to New York today would suggest that they weren't particularly successful, but that doesn't mean they didn't try very hard.
Right. Well, shall we move on? Excuse me. Shall we move on to our next
Sure.
audio
Okay,
and video?
the next one is a little more direct, I think, exemplifying a fire engine from right around the same period, and this is in Midtown, and we'll follow up with a letter of complaint that speaks to that specific kind of sound. So I'll just play a bit of the fire engine, and then we'll turn to a citizen's complaint about that noise. Okay, I think you get the picture, so to speak. Unlike our fire engines today, characteristically different sound. Here is a letter of complaint. And there are hundreds of letters like this one available on the website. This is Mrs. Jenkins, Louise Jenkins, who lived on East 78th Street, just a couple of, 20 or so blocks north of the fire engine we just heard, complaining about the sound of heavy trucking and fire engines. Let me just go to a close-up of some of her text. Mrs. Jenkins writes, can you do anything as a matter of the health of the community to have the heavy trucking diverted from Lexington Avenue to First or Avenue A? The noise is simply excruciating as they leave the throttle on their engines open, rails banging at a speed that must be 70 miles an hour all night long. The trucks are also the size of trolley cars in many instances, and on a street where we have the subway and trolley cars, it is simply unbearable to those who are obliged to spend the summer in town. In the summer, you had to open your windows. There was no air conditioning back then in residences, especially the old and sick, as I have in my family. So here, you're getting a sense of the ways that noise is a problem for her at certain times of day, certain kinds of noise. And a lot of it, as you can see here, is related to traffic. I also want to complain about the fire engines who have no mercy, leaving the throttles open unnecessarily all the time, but especially when they are returning from a fire. Okay, so noise she would put up with when they're on the way to a fire is unacceptable on the way home. They have also on their car whistle. Literally, she underlines screeching, which is really what we heard. That was a screeching whistle, which is perfectly unnecessary and far worse than any siren, and they blow it as loud as it will go. Can't this be stopped? The taxpayers should have some rights and to as much peace as one can have in town. I am not asking for more. So here, she's sort of feels qualified to complain about the situation because she is a taxpayer. Her notion of sort of, urban citizenry is based on being a property owner. She shouldn't have to put up with this. So there's lots to unpack, I think, in these letters. This one, particularly matches up with the sound that we just heard. I don't know if you have any other comments or questions that you would like to bring to that material. We can turn it over to you guys here. Yes, it is an inhuman noise. That's not the way fire engines sound today. And Mrs. Jenkins was pointing out, there are sirens, which I guess are more what we're used to, but this is different. This is a screeching whistle, and she just feels that's inappropriately loud. You don't need that to get people out of the way. So,
Well, Allison's comments give us a sense of how some of the people in the 20s might have felt about this, because for her, the sounds of India were new and they were unbearable, whereas the
right.
sounds of the U.S. are familiar and are bearable. So in the 1920s, this was new to everybody in New York and unbearable. I never thought I was sensitive to noise until that visit made me empathize with my students with autism who often have sound sensitivities. So what would be, if do you use these in your classes at Princeton, Emily? Do you use these clips
Well,
or like them?
the website only went up last year, and I've been on sabbatical this year. So I shared it with my students as it was in progress. We spent 3 years building this website. It took forever. So students were engaging with it in various ways, and I was just kind of sharing the results. But I didn't, other than just sort of asking them to tell me how the navigation worked, if the organization made sense. I really kind of used them to help us figure out how to design the site well. I haven't yet had the opportunity to really think about specific class exercises that draw
Mm-hmm.
upon the site as a sort of completed resource. So I'm open to ideas. I would welcome any thoughts, or if you try something in your class, and please let me know whether it works or not. That would be great to hear.
Okay, great. Well, shall we move on then? We're getting close to our concluding time.
Okay, I am just going to mention very briefly another resource that I guess we've posted to the forum, a handout, so to speak. I'll electronically hand it out to you all with approximately a half dozen or so more resources for historic sound recording that are available on the web and open access websites where you don't have to buy access to particular databases or things like that. I won't go through them all now here because time is short, but you can refer to that sheet and just spend time with them yourselves. Several of them are run through the Library of Congress's website. There's a sort of a place where a lot of old radio shows have been collected if you're interested in thinking about the ways that people listened to the radio for entertainment back in the Depression, say. There is a sonic memorial which is dedicated to the history of the World Trade Center neighborhood that goes all the way back to Radio Row, which we listened to, but carries up through the construction of the Twin Towers, their attack and destruction, and the rebuilding of that community. So if you're doing more recent history, that might be a useful resource. But I'll just leave that to you to pursue as you wish and on your own time. I'm just going to present a little conclusion here that you might find intriguing or your students might enjoy, but then I'll be happy to follow up with any additional discussion that you might want to bring to bear. Okay. In 1977, NASA launched 2 Voyager spacecraft. Just recently, the sort of outermost of those 2 spacecraft, they're still out there traveling out into space. The first one has just left our own solar system, and it is the first physical object from Earth to enter interstellar space. Attached to this spacecraft is a phonograph record. Indeed, those men in the white suits that you see in this image are attaching the record to the spacecraft in this photograph. That record, here is a close-up of it. It's gold-plated, and it's called The Sounds of Earth. And it's a recording filled with the kinds of sounds we talked about, the sounds of nature, music from cultures all over the world, speech. There's a greeting to whoever or whatever might encounter this recording, a greeting in 55 different languages, ancient and modern. And let me just play briefly a little clip from these greetings to our friends in solar systems far from our own.
Okay, Emily, do we need to hit the icon there on the slide?
Oh, I did that. It's playing for me. Can you not hear it?
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No, but that's okay. I've heard it. So as
Okay.
long as our participants can hear it, let me shut my mouth.
Well, hopefully you had a chance to hear that.
I got it. I got it now.
Yeah. Okay.
Oitinis poteste chairete. Eirenikos prosphilos elelutha.
All right. Well, that was just a sampling. That goes on for about 4 minutes or so. But I wanted to close with this sonic greeting. This is humanity's greetings to life forms other than our own, reaching out to who or whatever else might be listening out there in the dark vastness of space. I would propose that listening to ourselves here at home on Earth is just as important and just as much of an adventure. I hope our conversation this evening has given you some ideas for thinking about how to use sound in your teaching of history, or at least prompted your curiosity to come up with some ideas of your own. Ideally, considering the sonic culture of the past will not simply add a soundtrack to our historical understanding, but will challenge what we know about the past, open up new aspects, and ask new questions. It also offers a different means of engagement with the past for students, and I think that can be particularly useful for teaching in a secondary or even a primary school context. It seems to me it's a great way to capture the attention and imagination of students, and particularly those who might struggle with words or otherwise have intellectual talents that don't map as well onto our traditional ways that we learn history. And so I think that will conclude my own remarks here. Thank you again for taking time from your busy lives to hear my thoughts, and all the best. And again, do feel free to let me know how any sonic experiments go for you in your courses. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our seminar. And Emily, I have one final question. When they sent the Voyager into space, did they send any visual images, a visual counterpart?
Yes. There is also their analog recordings of photographs. So it's kind of like a video signal, an analog video signal, but they're not movies. It's just a series of hundreds of pictures of life on Earth as well.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Emily mentioned the forum. Please continue to use that. We'll monitor the forum not until April 30th, but until March 20th. That's a bit of a typo there. So let me, first of all, thank Emily for her presentation. I was going to say it was an illuminating presentation, but that's probably not the right adjective. So let me just say, Emily, you've given us a real earful.
Oh, thank you. Good night.
And I want to thank our participants for their participation this evening. I hope we have given you some things you can take back into your classes and use with your students, new ways to engage them. I know that teachers are always looking for that. Please go to americanclass.org for our upcoming seminars. Next Thursday night, which I think is the 12th, we'll be doing a seminar on To Kill a Mockingbird. So please tell your English teacher colleagues and everybody else that will be taking up that American classic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your participation. Emily, thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening.